Hello there guys and welcome to another episode of Genuine Chit-Chat. This week I am joined by Jack Thomas of the Just Conversations podcast. Now, some of your listeners may actually recognise the name Just Conversations podcast for two reasons. One of which is because I've played their promo on this show before, and I will be playing it again shortly in this episode. But also, I actually guested on an episode of the Just Conversations podcast. It was out the 26th of September 2020, and is episode number 4.09. And myself and Jack spoke for about 2 hours about the universe, God, divinity and existence, that sort of thing. Of clarity, I am either an agnostic or an atheist. It depends maybe on the day, but I don't actually necessarily believe there is a God, but that's the sort of discussion that we get into. And this conversation, if I would recommend people go back and check out that conversation. You don't need to listen to that to understand this at all. I don't think we even reference it, but if you like this conversation, you're going to really, really like the one I had with Jack on his podcast, because they're both two in the same. It's tackling very abstract ideas. So for clarity, this week is part one, and we speak a little bit at the start about the passive apocalypse and sort of left and right and the tribalism in America, but that isn't for very long. The conversation soon changes onto the main part of the conversation we want to talk about, which is whether the concept of good or evil actually exists. We also talk about the historic retelling of events that can alter perception, whether or not there's sort of intent can affect goodness of an action, the impact that religion has had on the perception of this, consciousness, heaven and hell, those sorts of ideas. And as I said, this is a very abstract conversation about things. This is all just kind of mine and Jack's opinions and some just ideas that we don't even necessarily believe in, but are just quite cool to discuss. That's the kind of conversation that we're going to have here. So guys, aside from that, I'm going to say that part two, as I said earlier, is going to be out next week on this very feed. But I've recently started a Patreon. Now, for clarity, Patreon, you basically pay a small amount of money and you get additional content. That's the short and the long of it. I'm going to give all the details and things at the end of this part one of the chat, just to give you guys more information, so I'm not bombarding you with information in this intro. But I want to clarify that on that Patreon, as well as a new show that myself and Megan are doing each week, where it's called Afterthoughts, we talk about a movie or a series that we just watched. In addition to that, when I release part one and part two of episodes from now on, I'm going to release the whole thing on Patreon. So if you listen to part one of this and you can't wait a week to listen to part two, go over to Patreon. You can do it for as little as £2, which I think is $3 a month, which is cheaper than one Starbucks a month. So if you're willing to give that kind of money, I would be very appreciative of that. There are a couple of tiers and whatnot, but basically if you give £2 a month, you'll get access to the new show me and Megan are doing, as well as whenever I release a part one and part two, you will get part one and part two in its own sort of episode, so you don't have to wait a week and there's no splitting of the episodes or anything like that. So if that's something that interests you, check it out. The link is in the description and I'll give you guys more information about it at the end. But anyway, aside from that, I'm going to play the Just Conversations promo and then we're going to get into the chat. So really hope you guys enjoy that and I'll talk to you at the end.
Hey, I'm Jack.
And I'm Christina.
And we're the hosts of the Just Conversation podcast,
a show where we critically think and discuss all sorts of exciting topics.
From the big pressing issues like artificial intelligence, space exploration, and government takeovers,
to the small ones like pollution in Pokemon, time-traveling cat people, and the portal we found in my backyard.
And we misinform all the time.
Yeah, it's great.
We're uncensored, politically incorrect, and childish.
Catch us on iTunes, Stitcher, Podbean, and all your podcasting apps.
And remember to take nothing personal. It's just conversation.
Welcome to Genuine Chit-Chat, where we have honest conversations with interesting people. And I'm your host, Mike Burton. I am here today with Jack of the Just Conversations podcast. Jack, it's great to have you on the show finally, because I came on your show. It came out a few months ago now, I think, but I kept it in my show notes and things for a while, and I'll be putting it in there again. So how have you been?
I've been great, man. Everything has been great on my end as usual, and living life, surviving the elongated, gradual, slow burn apocalypse.
The passive apocalypse.
Yes, it's the most boring apocalypse. We always wish we could have some zombies. We always wish for an alien invasion. We always wish for things that clearly the universe has a sense of humor and gave us the slowest burning possible.
It is one of the things that our generation, in a lot of ways, not necessarily hope for, but kind of in jest would hope for. Could they kind of be like, yeah, we had the sort of the renaissance of the zombies, especially all the movies and The Walking Dead and that sort of jazz. And there was always the apocalypse stuff around the sort of late 90s and early 2000s. It was just the big films that were always in with the very apocalyptic ones. And I think that comes a lot with us as a generation, and we kind of were like, yeah, wouldn't it be cool if there was a zombie apocalypse, or if the world would end, or finally capitalism would fall, and that sort of anarchistic ideas and stuff. And then it's like, here you go, everyone just is quite ill, and a serious amount of people are dying from it, but it's not like Ebola, so it's like it's not that manic. It's something more low key. It's still very scary and dangerous and things, but it's like, even the fact we're in a pandemic, the actual COVID itself isn't, as in air quotes, dramatic as so many, all the other pandemic films. You've got people like bleeding from all their orifices and screaming, or you got like 28 days later. I mean, it's
strange because most of us don't even get to see it. We only passively hear about it. We don't see people passing out in the streets, vomiting their guts out, manic, rampant running from one side to the other as we try to avoid the infected. Now we just hear they're in the hospitals or overflooding. The end.
Yeah, basically, and don't let grandma or anyone with an immune disorder go near anyone. And then masks over here are fairly one thing I do find weird about America, because I've got a few other mates who are in America, and we've spoken a little bit about the lockdown, that sort of jazz, is that over here there's a very, very, very small amount of people who don't wear masks. There's not that many, and they don't really seem to make much of a fuss. They just often quietly go in public places where you're meant to and don't wear it. And that's really it. You've just got the majority that wear it and then a few that don't. And that's about it. But in America, it's this big political thing of whether or not you wear a mask. And it's so baffling over here looking over, because it's like, if it even does nothing, it's such a tiny inconvenience.
Yeah.
What difference does it make,
The problem with that is that it was politicized by Donald Trump because he associated it with being a Republican and fighting for your liberties, as though your rights are being violated by being told to wear a mask. And I'm not sure how exactly the thoughts associated. I don't understand really, really, I have no idea how this came to be. It doesn't make any sense when you really think about it, but they thought it made sense and they rolled with it.
It's pretty weird. It just baffles me constantly in America, where it's just the politicization. I'm using terrible English here, but how politicized everything becomes, especially with not to get into a massive political discussion necessarily, but it is just strange that over here, people who are more left-leaning or more right-leaning in England generally just accept climate change as a thing. The Conservatives who are in power at the moment, they are doing things to try and reduce climate change and tackle pollution, that sort of thing. Not as much as people on the left would, but they still do it. Whereas it's not an argument of whether or not it's a thing. It's just how much money you put into it. Whereas over in America, it's like a lot of people on the right, especially, are like, no, you can't believe in climate change if you're on the right, because it's a political ideology rather than just this is the science is saying this is what it is.
The problem that we have in the US is this massive division between nobody wants to listen to anybody, right? So you have this consistent problem of we can't listen to each other. Additionally, that means that the people on the left, who tend to lean more towards a scientific mind, and the people on the right towards a more traditional conservative mind, they think that those values are political, and they think it's centric to the side you're on. So if I am a conservative and the left leans mainly towards science, I can't do that because that's against my identity. And this creates a problem that I was just having I don't know if you've ever heard of Kakao Talks. It's a Korean messaging app. It's sort of the Instagram of South Korea. And I use that because I might have heard
about it.
It's really good. I use it because it has chat rooms as well as text messaging and stores and a million things. They use that app for everything. And there's a philosophy group I'm in there that brought up this very question as to why the United States has this ongoing problem. And my response to the question was that the needing to divide what you're interacting with led to a situation in which one side is unwilling to learn from the other side. And we have a divisiveness that's created one-sidedness. We have scientific-minded people who think traditional values are irrelevant and useless. And so we can't have religion. We can't care about people's emotions. We can't, that's why they eat each other in the left so easily. Somebody said something wrong, destroy them.
Yeah.
The right is so traditional. They don't think anybody should be held accountable because we stick together no matter how much of a monster you are. And because our beliefs are so together, we must always follow these traditions, and science is moving away and we can't do that. So a divisiveness in which the science-minded don't think traditional values matters, and those with traditional values don't think that scientific mindsets matter, created a problem. A huge problem that even bled into the political system when it has nothing to do with politics. It's entirely based on the view the individual has. But this problem just kind of self-perpetuates, and it seems to have no end in sight.
I kind of visualize it in a sense of almost where you had some sort of flat ground and you had some people on the left side of a line and people on the right side of a line, and then quite a lot of people in the middle. And then what's seeming to happen is that the middle ground is starting to sort of crack open and become like a pit. And then one of each of the sides are kind of raising, like sort of tipping almost. So that the way to get from one to the other, from one side to the other, is becoming so much more difficult, where one platform is going higher than the other and the cavern in the middle is opening up. It's just, there seems to be less and less space for sort of centrists and middle ground ideas. It's more so nothing falls in the middle anymore. It has to be.
Oh yeah, for sure. That idea makes perfect sense, because if you're not with us, you're against us, and that applies to either side. So if you're centrist, you're against both sides, and nobody wants you.
Yeah, that's the problem, and it is that very much tribalism with the sort of us versus them sort of mentality, and sort of leaning into that in some ways is something that I want to speak with someone. I've had this noted down in my old notebook, because I've got a new notebook now. Huzzah! I've got some sort of just things I want to generally talk about on the podcast that I was just like, I want to talk to someone who is very interesting to talk to and has some perspectives that I want to hear. And the way you just articulated what's going on with the left and the right in America is spot on. So amazing with that. So I want to tackle the concept of good and evil, because it's something that I've just been wanting to kind of vaguely talk about for a while. So just with that, there's several little sort of things we can come off from that in itself. But if someone says the concept of good and evil, what's the first sort of thing you kind of generally think of in a way?
The first thought that comes to my mind, referencing that same philosophy group that we've had this very conversation in weeks long, I have completely landed on the idea that there is no such thing as evil. There is only our sort of thought about what could be evil. And I always like to, get as edgy as possible when I talk about it by just mentioning our ultimate concept of evil, which is Hitler. Obviously, we go to Hitler and everybody's like, he's evil. But then I just bring up the question, can you prove that? And it gets shaky immediately. For example, we have to first define evil, right? And so in order to know what it is, we can chalk off the things that it's not. So is evil an action? Well, no, because you can have an action and the motivation was good. So if somebody's suffering, for example, you put somebody in a hole and you torture them forever. Well, that's evil. Well, what's evil? The motivation, the want, the desire to do it, or the doing it part? Because what if a person landed in that hole and I couldn't get them out, but inevitably they end up suffering and it wasn't my fault. I want to get them out, but I can't, but it's my fault they're in there. Is it still evil, or is it an accident? So now it's an accident. Okay, so it can't be that the action is evil. So is it motivation that's evil? Is the what's propelling that motivation? Let's say I want to hurt a bunch. I want to hurt all the Jews. I'm Hitler, right? Okay. Is he evil, or is he reacting to something that happened to him? Because the United States shafted Germany for quite some time before that even happened. So he's reacting to what he thinks is actually right. He's not actively doing something that he thinks is bad. He thinks this is the right way to take. Okay. So that can't be evil because his motivations are good and he still did something we consider evil. So as long as we keep removing things, we eventually land at the idea that evil can't possibly exist, with the best example being God himself. we use God as a measurement for what's good and evil, but God's own, if we were to have a concept of evil, we'd have to measure it through God and say God himself is evil, which is problematic for a being that's supposed to be pure goodness. It's sort of conflicting that somebody would opt into, well, I know all the information in the world, but I'm still going to punish you for what I planned for you to do in the first place. Mm-hmm. So is that evil? And so we have all these kind of problems that prevent evil from being a concept that could exist.
I mean, that's a very good way of putting it, because I kind of have come to a similar sort of conclusion. And, you know, we're using the Hitler thing. It's exactly as you say. It's the problem is, if you look at Hitler, now, neither of us are saying that committing mass genocide in any form is good. But the thing is that if you go on Hitler predating those sort of, let's call them the more intense times, before that, he got Germany out of a recession, which was like worse than almost, I think Roosevelt was the only person who's managed to get a country out of recession that was that bad that quickly in that amount of time. I think it was Roosevelt. It might have been another American president. But he got him out of the hyperinflation crisis in no seconds flat. He was a very good leader in that way. That's how he got to the position of power. Now, I'm not saying the genocide was worth getting out of the inflation crisis, because that's ridiculous. But the fact is that, at least at the start in that way, it wasn't everything he was doing, even if you think that everything he was doing prior is evil. He still did something good, because he was trying to do, as you kind of, when you sort of spoke about it, it goes into he was trying to do the best for Germany. And although murdering Jews is a horrendous act to do, especially on the scale that he did, him thinking that it was the best thing to do, if, like, this is a horrible thing to think about, but if, say, the world had changed, something was different, and that was the case, and this history was, say, that had happened, and then Germany became the power of the entire world or something like that, and exterminated all the Jews, which is a horrendous, awful thought, they would write history in a way that would be like that was a good thing. Now, from then, that perspective of the modern era, which, you know, maybe America haven't committed necessarily the same level, excluding the Native Americans. Like, that's quite a good parallel in that way, which is one sort of thing I've heard from history is, you know, good and evil is just who won the wars and who writes the history books. Because it's only been until the last few decades in America where it's been really viewed that, you know, Columbus Day and stuff was full of atrocities because of the genocide of people and all the sort of other things that go along with that. So it is sort of, history definitely alters the perception of what good and evil actually is, depending on who's writing the history books and who.
Well, here's what's interesting about that. That's assuming that a person's perspective on the concept of evil is accurate. And then we have to assume that a collective view on the same thing is even more accurate, which just getting people to agree on the definition is not, right? So if we were to say evil alone, and we were to say that the situation that happened with World War II is evil, well, what was evil about it? Which part? Okay, so they wrote in history, well, it was bad, but was it evil? I've come to learn that the concept of evil is ideological to the point that it's not even your intention, but sort of the lack of intention, if that makes sense. So you can't wake up one day and say, I'm going to do something bad because I like it. Because that's not evil. Because your motivation is you like it. You're looking for pleasure. There's something fueling what you're looking for. And the search for what you love, we all do that all the time. It might show itself in a way that's bad, and you're doing something bad to please yourself. But is it evil? Not necessarily. I've come to think of the concept of evil as doing something bad for the sake of doing something bad. Like, you can't even really do it because you enjoy doing it, but simply because you're doing it. And like, what example for that exists other than a deity that would do it, knowing every possible outcome and still deciding to punish something that he laid out? There'd be no other possible scenario. You could decide, I'm going to go torture a whole family because I get off on doing it. Well, no, now you have the motivation of getting off on doing it. There's something pushing the action. It has to be evil for the sake of evil, because anything that, so saying that in the people who won the war got to write what was evil, they might have called it evil, but they're wrong, because they're not talking about something evil. They're talking about the side that lost, essentially.
No, exactly. And it is also, even when you think of like in a lot of biblical terms, the devil is one who's considered evil, but he punishes those who are bad. So it's like, but is that a net good thing? Like, is that not something that, like in a lot of the religious texts, especially the Abrahamic ones, some of them, more so Christianity and Catholicism, there is the heaven and there's the hell. So it's like you do good, you get rewarded, you do bad, you get punished. But it's like, that's, I think, where a lot of the idea of good and evil came from. Because, if you turn it slightly and you say, like, what is the concept of good? It's like, well, there's that huge argument of, like, when you do something nice, it feels good to do that nice thing. You get this sense of, I don't know, just goodness, morality, whatever you want to call it. It's just, it feels good to do nice things,
But I disagree that in itself being good, because that's
selfish.
Trying to please. Yes, exactly.
So good isn't good almost. So that's the weird thing.
It's pleasure. It's the same as bad. If it's motivated by something, it's just bad. It's not evil. So they both have to be self-fueled to even exist. In order for something to be good, it has to be good regardless of how you felt about it. You should be able to do something good because it's good, even if you feel bad doing it. Mm-hmm. And that's a weird situation. And talking about the devil particularly, what a weird one to call evil. Versus the God who actively punishes good people, when the devil's entire Lucifer, let's not say the devil, because that's a weird other problem of language that took place over time. But Lucifer's entire argument was, how are you better than any of us if we're all just beings that exist? We should be equals, not you superior, and I just bow and take punishment because you felt like it when you designed the universe with perfect knowledge. The existence of Lucifer in its own was an intention of Jehovah. How weird to then turn around and punish him for something you designed the universe for him to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's one of the big issues I've had with a lot of religion, in a way of having that sort of, it's God's plan, or God does this, or God does that. Or it's more so the infallible side of things, when you're like, you can't argue with that side, you can't argue with that. It's just like, there are holes in it. It doesn't mean that you can't take good things and positive things from religion and whatnot. It's more just like the basic general lessons of most religions are positive. It's just that when you get into people arguing about the details or enforcing interpretations of things and crushing people's human rights and that sort of stuff, once you get into that realm, it becomes very messy. But you strip it all back and it's meant to be good. And it's the same with the concept of good and evil, the heaven and hell. The idea of it is just meant to be, look, don't be bad, don't be a piece of shit, because if you are, then bad things will happen to you. And I think Buddhism, if I'm correct, that's got the idea of sort of karma, and you do like positive things. And I don't know if I'm getting you're much more knowledgeable about that sort of side of things. What would karma fall under?
Karma, I'm not sure. It's more of a spiritualism thing, because Buddhism itself doesn't really have karmic response. Buddhism kind of says you are everything, so you wouldn't be punishing yourself in Buddhism. Karma lays in a more of a spiritualism. If you think zodiac type of things, if you think spiritualism, magic, that kind of thing, karma is the universe responding to your behaviors directly. So the same way that you can put things in a bowl and alter the universe by chanting a couple of times, the universe can respond to things you've done negatively.
I see. Yeah. So in that sort of that realm of thinking with karma and with heaven and hell, they are generally similar interpretations of the same thing. It's just, generally speaking, it's just be good. Good things will happen, and that is how I think humans have tried to define good and evil, because it kind of goes back to when laws were being created and civilization became more civilized and like language became more complicated and things. It wasn't very easy to just be like, oh, don't do that. Why do I not want to do that? Because of this. Well, what if I want this? It becomes easier just to go, look, don't do that. It's evil. What do you mean it's evil?
Yeah.
Evil, you burn in hell. And if that happens, and that's kind of like a good full stop.
Well, here's an interesting way to look at this. There's a philosophy that claims that there's a perfect something for everything, and everything is an estimation of that perfect something, right? Mm-hmm. So like, why do we know that a dog's a dog if there's dogs of different sizes, different shapes, different hair lengths, different head size? Because there's this perfect something that is the middle ground of what all the dogs are. So the same idea would apply to the concept of evil, and that in a transcendent kind of way, there is the ultimate evil that does exist, but it can't physically exist in our way of being, in our dimension of 3D existence. But there's a perfect something. And when we say evil, we're kind of referencing that indirectly because we can't touch that. But all the sort of estimately close, similar kind of sort of might be things are what we're referring to as evil.
Yeah, same with good, isn't it? Because you've just got this sort of archetypes of good. Everyone, a lot of individuals, especially in the Western world, in both, America and in England, is sort of, when you think of it, good, pure, perfect. I don't know about you, but I think of angels, God, that sort of, in air quotes,
yes.
God. It's just, I'm not a religious individual, but if you tell me what's the ultimate goodness, I would just think of an angel without even trying to think of anything. That's just what's been drummed into me with that concept of good. So it's just bouncing off what you were saying.
Yeah. Because it's like the perfect. When you think of good, perfect good, you think of that sort of celestial perfection. And then everything else is kind of sort of like it. And that's sort of the biggest problem with staying on the whole fucking religion angle of this. We kind of lean a bit into the Jesus problem with that, right? Because he's here and present, allegedly. He was here, he walked the earth or whatever. And was he pure good, or was he as close as you can get without being?
Maybe that's sort of he got to to put a number on it, which is not something one can do in this sort of situation, but to kind of visualize it, almost he was as close to 100% you could get, which is say 95%. But if he became 95.1, the turning of the page of the metaphysical and physical aspects of being good would be impossible to be in that form in some sort of weird way, because you have to become almost like a force to become that level of good. Oh my
God, you just blew my mind. Okay, here's a way to think about that, bouncing off of what you're saying. If you're trying to travel the speed of light, for every mile per hour you're trying to increase, it requires way more energy. So every mile per hour, you more and more energy. And then when you're at 99.99% the speed of light, to finish that 0.01%, you need an infinite amount of energy in order to match the speed of light. It would be impossible. It would take too much. If we say at 1 mile per hour, the page turns per second, but at 10 miles per hour, it turns per minute. Eventually, you have a page that's stuck turning through infinity just to get to the last side of that page. And you'll never make it to that side because it's impossible. You'd have to not physically exist to make it that far.
Yeah. And that, going with exactly what you're saying, is I think the concept of maybe pure good or even pure evil in that sense, because it's both an idea and can be done by, it's a combination of sort of, maybe if these things exist, it is a combination of, say, motivation, but also what you actually do with it. But in all the sort of layering of it, because it becomes such a mixture between the physical and the metaphysical, as you say, that to become 100% of it is just impossible. It's that sort of what's the idea where you can kind of, if you keep fractioning something or keep halving it, like you go at 1 and then you halve that and it becomes half, and it becomes infinite. You could if you add on, that was it. If you get 1,
the turtle versus the hare.
If you add on a half constantly, you will never ever get to the end, because if you half of whatever it is you're on, it's that sort of idea that you can never get there.
Now
because
that's the whole.
Yeah, it's the infinite whole.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting about that is if you use the system of the Hermetic principles, it quite explicitly says that there's no such thing as good or evil right off the bat. It says that everything is centric. It's the middle. Everything is just the middle. And all you're doing is labeling opposite extremes, right? So if you look at male and female, they're both just human. They're both people, they're gender. You're talking gender when you say male or female. You say up or down, that's just two, like, when is up? If you're up, is there a new up? Yeah, there's new up. You made it to the up, now there's a new up. If you go down more, well, there's a new down from where you currently are. You're just labeling different extremes. And in the case of good and evil, you could just say that there's neutrality. But if you only had evil, but didn't have good, is evil evil, or is that just the middle?
Yeah, that's a good point. And the same with good. If everything's pure and good, if there's never any bad, then how could anything truly actually be good if nothing's bad?
Because you're comparing it to something. You need the opposite to compare it to. Otherwise, if everything was always good, that'd be normal. And you'd just be judging what's gooder than that good being good and what's slightly less good than that good, but might still be good. Now that's a new evil, because it's just you have a baseline and all you're doing is measuring from the middle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's one of the issues that I've always had with the concept. Like, I went to Catholic primary school, so that was from the age of 5 to the age of 10 or 11, I think it is. And my parents, neither of them are especially religious; they're both agnostic. And my secondary school, which would be your guys' middle school and high school, that was just atheist, or no religion. And I just remember when I was younger in school and things, my big query, even when I was like sort of 9, getting towards the end of that sort of school, I was like 9 or 10 years old. I remember thinking, I was like, but I don't understand heaven for 2 reasons. One, I don't understand eternity, but also because I don't understand how you wouldn't get bored of things, how everything could just be perfect. How could you actually, not only how could you possibly live in a world where everything is perfect, so I can make the ideal living space, but if I go to stub my toe, instead of stubbing my toe, I get an orgasm. Is that how perfect it becomes because you can never be pain? Or like, obviously I didn't think that exact thought when I was 10.
Well, I actually went through exactly the same problem. That was sort of one of my initial jumping off points when sort of looking into religion. It was sort of the fact that heaven doesn't make sense, and literally starting as you just described with, this sounds boring as hell. And like, all right, so I die and I go to heaven, and all these concept of sin ceases to exist. All right, so I live a life of sin because we're human according to religion. Everything you do is sin. So do you mean I get to heaven and I don't remember anything? I'm a blank slate now. Okay, then what's the point of the heaven reward if I won't remember that I earned it?
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing with hell. So I go to hell and I suffer forever, but do I manage to retain the life I lived? Is that the more ideal? Yeah, I suffer forever, but then let's think of the concept of forever. If you suffer forever, then that's the normal. You're no longer suffering and you manage to keep your memory. What the hell?
Mm.
But you also are there forever. How long before your memory is there such a small fraction that you experience? You're here 100 years, but you spend trillions and trillions and trillions. Does now even matter when you're there? Even in heaven, you live a perfect life for 100 years and you go to heaven. Who gives a shit a trillion years from now when 100 years was such an instant blip that it does not matter? You don't care. It never mattered. Even if you had perfect memory of everything that happened, do you give a shit?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting idea, because I've thought of the sort of idea of eternity and things, but not with identity and memory, because, yeah, surely, I wonder if in theory, if you put all humans eventually on some sort of in heaven for eternity, if they'd all kind of end up in the same place. Like, have you seen there's a Netflix show called The Good Place? Have you seen it?
Yes, the whole thing.
It is phenomenal. I love it, and I think if anyone's seen it, I really recommend it. It's made by Michael Schur. He's the one who he co-created Brooklyn Nine-Nine. He made Parks and Recreation. He co-created The Office. He's produced Master of None. He plays Mose in the US Office. That is, he's incredible, and he's done lots of other cool stuff. That show of his, first couple of seasons, I was like, this is amazing. This is so clever. But that last season brought up so many genius questions of like the whole idea of it. This is kind of a spoiler for people listening, but in some way I'll try not to delve into the specifics of Good Place, but there's a concept that comes out of it, which is if you go to eternity and you go to heaven, if there's nowhere else to go, you just won't enjoy anything, because you'd be there, be able to get anything you want all the time so much it would just become numb. But if you enter some sort of exit strategy to be able to end your existence by maybe becoming one with the universe or something like that, then you've always got that next thing to look forward to, which makes now meaningful.
Yes. It's sort of the concept that the ride is what matters, not the destination. So if you have a future destination that isn't where you currently are matters because you're going to do things, you're going to want to do things. If where you currently are is infinity, well, I don't have to do anything because I'll have forever to do it whenever. But if eventually I can enter the next place, I'm going to actively do everything I want here because I want to get over there, but I don't want to miss out on things here. And so now purpose has been established because another place that you can't come back from has been offered. And you got to maximize this experience before the next experience. Mm-hmm. And that's basically the concept of heaven.
Yeah, except with heaven, there's not that explicit mention of the thing after that. That's kind of, that's the end point. And it is just, because I've always thought, I was like, oh, what would I do if I went to heaven? Well, I'd be like, well, I would watch every single film ever. I would watch probably every TV series ever. I'd listen to all albums ever, which would take some unknown stupid amount of time. But if you're there forever, then as you say, there's not even a proportion, because if I just consumed all media that humans are ever going to create, ever, if I just spend that amount of time, again, it means that only half of my life has been consumed by that stuff. Well, if I have infinite, it only takes a certain amount of time before that infinity becomes, as you say, that almost blip of, it's just like zooming out constantly, isn't it? Of just like, you zoom out so much and much and much. It's just like, you run out of things to do. Even and in hell, being tortured forever. How could you be tortured forever? What, you peel my skin off forever? I'm on fire forever. There would just be a point where
it's normal.
You wouldn't. Yeah, it would be the normal, as you said. It'd be like you either wouldn't feel it anymore, or you'd go, that would be fine. And then what? Can you start enjoying hell? Would that become a thing? Like you enjoy the lesser tortures more?
When it comes to the torture specifically, I had a theory that so you experience so much pain forever, your coping mechanisms become astounding, right? So let's say some rule of the physics that create hell says you could legitimately suffer forever and never adjust, right? So you legitimately never adjust to the fact that you're suffering. The fact that you're down there with full awareness says consciousness transcended the physical body, meaning your conscious mind is what's getting tortured because your body died up here. Mm-hmm. In that case, your conscious mind is a thing independent of body. And as you're getting tortured, your coping mechanisms would become so powerful that you could tune out of the torture and collapse into your own conscious mind, generating your own universe and being the God within your own conscious existence. To say that the global consciousness could be that experience and that we are just existing in this global consciousness system in which something is in hell being tortured and generated the universe we're in as it collapsed into itself.
I mean, that is obviously as an interesting theory, and it's one of those nice theories. It's one of the ones I like because my favorite theories are the ones where I could say that could definitely be the case, but it also could not be, and that is the good way of wrapping it up, rather than having like sort of big. One of the reasons I love speaking with you so much and listening to your podcast and stuff is just discussing ideas of what could be. Like there's so many things. Like I think I can't remember if we vaguely spoke about it when I came on your show, but just like simulation theory, like it's such a cool idea to me because I don't necessarily believe we are in a simulation, but if you listen to the logic behind it, then in theory, by probability, we almost certainly are in a simulation. But regardless of whether or not, it's like, well, if people don't know, for listeners, it's basically, if there is a reality that could create a simulation by, say, in this reality, say we're 100 years away from making a perfect simulation that's so perfect that you wouldn't be able to tell if you're in a simulation or not. Well, if they created that, a machine created that, they'd obviously create more than one. They'd probably have to create millions upon billions upon God knows how many, the supercomputer, to be able to make the perfect one, or they would just need to work it out. Who knows what sort of reasoning they would need to do. But if you just think of almost like in the really small key, a video game creator makes 10. Well, that means that there are 11 realities. There's the one that it's got the virtual realities within it, and then there's those other 10. So if you think, if there's only 11 in existence, by probability, statistically, it's only 1 in 11. So we're probably actually not the ones who are in it.
Exactly. It's way less likely. Not only that, but if you were to create a perfectly flawless, undetectably different simulation, you should be able to, within the simulation, recreate everything that's within the actual physical existence that created it. So within the simulation that's perfect and created a perfect simulation, you should, in theory, be able to create your own perfect simulation because it's perfect. Mm-hmm. So you should be able to do what was possible in the reality that made you, which includes creating a simulation. And if you follow not just the fact that base reality could have made an infinite number of simulations, but if any of them are perfect, every single one of those perfect ones then should, in theory, have the same possibility and capability of creating a perfect simulation. And then you follow that train of thought, there's an infinity versus one.
Exactly. If you can create a simulation that is perfect, it can then, in theory, create another simulation that's perfect and therefore infinite. And it's just that thing of, is it likely that we are the only universe? Not getting into parallel universes or anything like that, just that one idea. And it's like, well, statistically speaking, no. I mean, I like to think we're probably not in a simulation, but sometimes you see things like me and my girlfriend, Megan, we were walking out. When was it? It was the other day. It was probably 2 months ago now. I think it's before Christmas. We just went for a walk with our friend and walked through this sort of nature reserve and things. And we saw this bird that was flying, but it was literally complete. There's no wind. It was completely still in the air with its wings out, not moving at all. It wasn't going up and down slightly or anything. It was literally dead still. And we looked at that and we all looked at each other. We're like, has that bird glitched? And it was like it for a while when we were staring at it, and then it suddenly they moved again, but we were looking at it for about 30 seconds. Now, I do not believe that the reality we live in has necessarily glitched, but it's quite fun to think, if we are in a simulation, that is a glitch.
Yeah,
I can't explain that.
Oh, no, that's definitely easy to explain. The bird was gliding on the air pressure that was coming towards it. That means at a high enough altitude, there was wind you weren't feeling. Mm-hmm. And the bird was just tilted up enough to have that pressure push it back while its forward momentum meet at equal intervals, and it just stays in place.
Yeah. Exactly.
And from a point of view away, it does look really weird. Like there's just the bird stopped moving. But that's really unique. Now, you mentioned multiple universes, which I find completely interesting that you could have, sticking to the video game metaphor, any other game would be an alternate universe. Mm-hmm. And the easiest way to think about that would be, let's say you have The Witcher. Mm-hmm. And you have Grand Theft Auto. Mm-hmm. Now, you, Mike, owns both these games, and you could go and play some Grand Theft Auto and then go turn that off and put on some Witcher. That is a parallel version of you from a different game in a different universe experiencing different scenarios. If you were to tell somebody in Grand Theft Auto that you are a higher being, they would just think you're crazy. I'm in a higher dimension and I just jump in here randomly. Sometimes it's not even me. Sometimes my girlfriend takes over and I'm behaving differently. And that's because a different conscious mind is running me. And how weird of a multiverse is that? And if you think of, for example, we think of dissociative identity disorder, right? Somebody's just roaming the street, they snap, and now they're suddenly somebody different. And it's like, what the fuck is happening? Your behavior is different. You say your memories are different. What are you talking about? You're still the same body. How do we know that somebody that just didn't pass the control and it's like the little brother playing the game instead?
That's an interesting idea. There's that kind of rolls into the idea of free will and determinism. That sort of idea that like no one has free will. We have the illusion of free will. But the easiest way I kind of rationalize it to explain to people is if you got a computer and you basically got it to absorb all conceivable information about oneself, both with nature and nurture, so all of your genes and everything like that and the history of your entire family, mixed with every experience you've ever had up to a point from every conceivable way you would interpret that information. If you got a computer strong enough to do that, and you had the information and the data to back up, you could then, in theory, predict someone's next moves. By the sheer amount of information you've got, you could work out probabilities of someone doing something. Well, yeah. If you have that sort of idea, well, in theory, then we don't choose to do any of those things. Like, I'm not saying, like me having a strong work ethic, I think, I got that from my dad. My dad had a strong work ethic and he was a successful individual because of that. But also, maybe there's a gene which made me like that. But I don't wake up in the morning and choose to have motivation necessarily or choose to be hardworking. I've just got this kind of vague push on the inside of me, making me kind of do stuff. Like some people call it intuition, the voice in your head, whatever it is. Who's to say that isn't, as you say, like just some person controlling you, like The Sims or something like that? It's just you think it's your own thought making you think that when it's just someone else inputting commands.
Isn't that weird? Because you'd have to argue that it is your own thoughts simultaneously. As much as it's not, it is. And it's weird because, for example, your character in Grand Theft Auto could not behave without it, but your character in Grand Theft Auto is you. It's not somebody else. You could put the control down and leave and nothing is happening. So it's both you and not, it's an estimation. It's a fraction, a slice of who you are, but it's not really who you are. And it's sort of, if you think of the breakdown of dimensions, right? So you're standing outside and you see a shadow. That shadow doesn't do anything you don't do. It doesn't do it exactly. It can't. It's fucking shadow. It's an estimation. But you are actively choosing to move, and so that moves too. But if you go up a dimension from the third to the fourth, there is a version of you that exists through all of time in your lifetime. So from the moment you're born to the moment you die, there's some sort of snake in a higher dimension that's every moment starts small at one side, gets bigger, and then gets small again, vanishes into nothing. And that's your entire timeline. Now, as that moves, so do you. And as you move, so does the shadow. But you're not your whole timeline. You're just a moment. You're a shadow. You're a shadow now to that. And that's choosing to do everything, but kind of you are too, and sort of the shadow too. It's just a different look of how you're trying to do things. The shadow isn't not you. It's totally you. It's 100% you. And so is that snake at the higher dimension. And if you follow that snake to the next one, then you have a million different beginnings. One beginning that branches off into how many different timelines? So you just got like a sphere with a bunch of snakes coming out of it. They all have the same starting point, but all the different possibilities you could have taken. Now, each one of those snakes is connected to that one thing. It's still the same thing. But when you look at the one snake, you're just looking at the one snake. It's a shadow, an estimate, a part of it. And you're just a small part of the snake. And the shadow is just a small part of you. The character is the same thing. It's a small part of you. The actions reflect your actions. The behaviors reflect your behaviors. And the same way you can decide, I'm going to go walk to the store. The shadow didn't decide to walk to the store. You did. But kind of also, so did the shadow.
Yeah. I almost think about it like we've discussed, I think with, it might have been the Hermetic principles we discussed on your show, but I think it was basically the water sort of idea. And maybe it's sort of the you who is in this physical realm. Let's say the version this is, you're, I kind of think of it like let's call it a soul, just for ease, because it's the easiest way to kind of rationalize it in a way. Your soul is, say, 100% you, in air quotes. What makes you, you? It's your personality and all that sort of jazz. When it's inside of you, this meat vessel, you can only actually convey about 80%, maybe if that as an argument, 80% of how you're feeling, who you are, what you are in a lot of ways. You know, I'd probably argue it's even less than that, but let's say 80. And the other 20 is just the thoughts that no one else, even if you tell them, they can never fully understand or comprehend. So you think, okay, well, so your meat vessel is only 80%-ish of what you kind of want to show. And each method of communication is then another fragmented amount of that. So say when you text someone, it then becomes only 20% of what, that person is from you. And you could say, in a sense, the different versions of yourself, like in video games, they take a portion of that. So when you play Grand Theft Auto and things, if that character it's got different attributes and things and a different reality, because obviously it can go around and it can die and then respawn immediately and things like that. It's got this sort of infinite life thing in a way. And it's being controlled by a dilution of yourself, like a droplet of your water of personality into that vessel to kind of make it work. And it's interesting to think like, this is one thing that baffles me that I haven't heard religion talk about as much, or more so the mainstream religions or ones that we hear over here as much, is thinking, why couldn't someone just say, that's God? And that little droplet that becomes your soul, that is your personality, you are just God has every conceivable personality type and interest and everything. He is just this big pool of absolutely everything that could ever be conceived. And you are just bits and pieces of that kind of dropped out into this meat vessel. And that's what kind of makes you, you. You're just these random droplets of the universe to make you, like
100%. And I like that visual of you sort of being the soul of your character, because in reality, that's exactly what's going on, right? Like you can only do as much as the universe you're inhabiting allows you to. So let's say you're playing Michael in GTA. You can't go up to Franklin and be like, bro, I'm in a higher dimension. That's impossible because the game doesn't have those mechanics even built in. That's the same way I can't walk up to you and be like, this is what the real me looks like, man. Because I don't even know what the real me looks like. Does your character in GTA know what you, the player, looks like? Or is that an idea that isn't even in their mind? They couldn't comprehend something higher than them. They think everything they're doing is them. But it's you. And really, you're just their soul. The same way that we are just a small part of something bigger kind of funneling into us. It's a very interesting visual to assume that we are the soul of something smaller, because that is to say that there's something bigger that is the soul of us. And as above, so below, I'm sure God sits somewhere questioning, is there something higher than me?
Yeah, because I always feel like in regards to the idea of God and things, I think I've said to you before, just my general idea is just the entire universe is just this consciousness of energy, and we're all just a part of that consciousness of energy. I don't believe it's a white dude in the sky with a beard who is thinking things are good and bad and made the universe and or the world or solar system in 7 days, anything like that. I just think there is this almost unconscious consciousness, like the consciousness of the universe is not necessarily self-aware. It's just made up of every living being's consciousness within it, and it just kind of makes this big network of consciousness happen. And that's how energy is kind of spread. And that's what air quotes life is just air quotes life. The difference between a tree, for example, and say a rock is that even though the rock's got sort of, microbes within it into sort of smaller ways, the level of consciousness is not got as much of that in air quotes, that universal water, that energy of dilution of whatever that is. And that could be energy, that could be life. And that's kind of vaguely how I kind of see it in a way. I don't know why I keep doing a lot of water things today.
Well, it's a really good metaphor, especially because the Hermetic principles and Hinduism kind of do that. The collective energy is the ocean. Precipitation makes us clouds, which would be demigods, angels, and these sort of transcendent things we could fathom but not understand. And then that rains down the water drops that are independent perspectives, which is us, until we die and rejoin the ocean to just repeat the cycle forever. It's never not one thing, but it kind of is all at the same time. It's weird that we're many water drops, because under that idea, I'm no different than you. We're the same person. We're just two different perspectives of the same consciousness, exploring possibilities. But now it's interesting to think that, because what stops that entire water system from itself being a single water drop if you zoom out far enough? So it's trapped within a bubble of its own, where there is an ocean, there are clouds, and there are water drops. And that's our entire ecosystem. But if you backed away, that's just one bubble, and you see billions of bubbles that are their own oceans, own clouds, and own water drops coming down. And then you back far enough from that, and then you again have a bubble containing all those bubbles. And you can do this forever with seemingly anything. At what point do we say that that is its own thing, and that's a different thing over there, rather than everything as one?
Because it's also, if you think about it, when people, some people listening, they may be finding it hard to visualize, but if you do it in the reverse, you think, if you go down to microscopic levels, the world, if anyone has seen the film Ant-Man and the Wasp, is probably the most recent one I can think of, which is, there's a point where Ant-Man goes down to what's the word? Subatomic, that's the word. And he sees tardigrades and things like that. And the world is this strange, bizarre reality. But you can go even smaller than that. And in Ant-Man, he goes into the fractal realm and things like that. And it's like that whole idea of, if you go small enough, you can go into universes that you couldn't comprehend existing. And they have different rules to their sort of realities. And who's to say that we're just not one of those magnifications? Like, if you zoom out enough, what you would think that life is, in air quotes, or what the true universe is, you wouldn't think it's people or humans or anything like that. You would just think, oh, it's planets and stars. If you zoom out further, you think, oh, it's just made of galaxies. Like, depending on where the microscope, like an ant doesn't perceive the world as inhabited by humans necessarily. They view it as their own world. Interesting.
Because there's a couple of things about that. First, if you become subatomic, right? You become subatomic and say, this is your new normal. Is there something subatomic compared to you at this new normal? And there should be. There should always be. probably called something different. And also Ant-Man would have died because he's smaller than air particles, but that's a whole other different argument. Yeah, that's a whole other argument. The fact that tardigrades weren't microscopic, but rather subatomic, that's also another problem. But let's ignore all the discrepancies happening there. If he became subatomic, there should in theory be a subatomic to that. And if he were to become that subatomic, would that again have something subatomic? And then this also goes back to how we ended up describing good and evil, which is there's just a center point that you're labeling shit. That's really what it comes down to. You're saying left and right, but that's just direction. And if you get small enough, you'll notice that, okay, there's a solid table, and that table is one thing. And there's a solid rock, and that rock is one thing. But you become subatomic and you realize that's not one thing, that's billions and trillions of smaller things. And if you were to then zoom into those are billions. So you get to the atom and then you zoom in, what do you get? You get Higgs boson particles. Like, okay, but that's the smallest we can see right now. Mm-hmm. If we could see smaller, would that just be composed of a bunch of other shit? And is then everything just many things, or is everything just one? Like if we zoom out, can we even see ourselves on Earth from far enough? No. It's just a planet. It's just, that is one thing. And if you don't know there's life, you just think of that planet as a singular thing. It's just one thing. But then you zoom in and realize, holy crap, it's made up of a bunch of shit. And you zoom in again, well, those shits are made up of a bunch of shit. You can do that forever, in every direction, bigger or small, as above, so below.
I think one of the reasons I find, and it's bouncing off something specific you said there, is I think one of the reasons that, we live in, is the reality we live in, it's, is it 4D or 5D? Is 5D's parallel, isn't it? So it's 4D. Is that?
Yeah, 4D I think is the current up to counting time. Yeah. So
with that sort of in mind, let's argue that we only have senses that we can sort of measure and comprehend that check through 4D space, in a sense. One thing that kind of made me think of that is the reasons humans need a scale, as you say, is like a point. Like the way we know things are small and the way things are big is because we, in our minds, almost draw a line in the middle and put smaller ones on the left and bigger ones on the right, or whatever, how you do it. And we do that with everything. We were doing it with the political discussion, the left and the right. We've somehow made political ideas move to the left or the right of this imaginary line, like every concept of good and evil, neutral being in the middle, like everything we need a scale for. And I wonder if that's because the senses we have aren't capable of thinking without the need for a scale. And maybe that's what the sort of the next level of either human evolution is in millions and millions of years or whatever, and becoming beings that inhabit space, maybe even outside of time and things like that, or just outside of this, the meat vessels we have. To transcend that, we would need senses capable of reading and measuring and understanding higher levels of space. And maybe that's one of the reasons, is because we need that sort of that line to comprehend where left and right of things are, because we can't comprehend things in a different way of looking at it or feeling it.
Yeah, 100%. I can prove your statement true right now. If you removed the line between you and I, what do you have? It's impossible to grasp it, right?
Yeah.
Like if we say that we're not two different individuals, how do you visualize the fact that we do see each other as different individuals? Because our senses are limited. They can only see us as different individuals, but we know that's inaccurate. If you go up enough dimensions, it just kind of all meets at the top somewhere. And we don't even have to max out going up. I think in like the 7th we meet up. And so the question would be, why is it impossible for us to even comprehend? You just said it. I can say it out loud and still not have a mental image of what the middle ground between you and I would even look like. What does that mean exactly? It's a weird thing that we can't even conceive of, although physics itself tells us that's the case. String theory, for a fact, not even talking Hermetic principles, not discussing spiritualism, not talking Buddhism, not talking Hinduism, science. String theory says you go up high enough, everything meets. So why can't I think of what it looks like if we take the line out?
I feel like maybe the reason, a way that I kind of visualize being unable to visualize things is almost, and it works well with the term thought bubble. If you think of a thought bubble as in like an actual literal bubble and you're standing in the middle of it, you can kind of just, you can look around everything that's inside of the bubble, but your vision gets to the end of the bubble, to the edge, but you can't actually see the edge of the bubble. You can kind of, you see like this, if you're somehow standing magically in the middle of an actual like bubble made out of, soap or whatever, you look around and it'd be hard to see the edges. You would just kind of see this odd curvature almost of your vision. And you'd look all around in this bubble, but you wouldn't, if you try and move forward and the bubble moves with you, you could never go any further than that. And that's almost what I think humans, how they think, how we think. I am one. I'm an alien. That's it, guys. That's actually
I feel like you've revealed yourself inadvertently.
Exactly. Quick, we can't tell them. Skate over it. So like thinking in a thought bubble, I think that idea, like quite spherical, it seems to be quite common in a lot of things to do with humans, how we visualize stuff. So I wonder if that's kind of our own senses are this bubble around us, which make us be able to perceive things in our immediate vicinity, but actually do prevent us from seeing beyond the horizon.
Well, then I have two interesting points to make off of that. First, your description of the thought bubble is exactly how the universe functions. Get on a rocket ship and start moving forward. Tell me you're not always at the center of wherever you're moving and that there's always only the same distance of view in every direction. The literal perceptive bubble surrounds the perceiver. You can only see this much forward, and no matter how far you get, that is always the case. And you don't really see the edge, but you somehow see the back in front of you. And that's how the universe behaves. We call that the microwave background radiation. And we see it, and no matter how far we get, we're still seeing the back and the front simultaneously in front of us. And that works in every direction. Doesn't matter where we go. We go far enough, it's the same shit, no matter where we go. Now, I find it interesting that as you're talking about it, and this is specifically calling you an alien at this point, where you, in thinking of consciousness and thought and how the universe works independent of identity, you subconsciously enter a space in which even the concept of human is other. It's the other thing. And that's because that's the more natural state. The more natural state, if you're not actively thinking me, I, but you're just thinking in the void of what thought is, you start kind of losing that self of identity. That's what meditation does, essentially. That's what LSD and DMT, these drugs that strip you of the filters you were programmed with as you are being raised. They remove all those things so that me, that I, sort of fades to the background. And when people get into, let's say you're writing, let's say you're painting, you sort of lose the me, the I, while you're doing it. You enter this flow state. I'm sure you've heard that a million times, flow state. You lose identity, and now you're just kind of present, doing a thing that doesn't require even knowing your memories. You don't think of anything. It's just a thing that's happening almost without you, but using you as the vessel to make it happen. And so in your thinking about this, without attaching yourself to it, you kind of almost removed yourself from it and entered a more pure state of thought, where it was just the thought of what is thought minus the physical presence generating the thought. That goes to say you believe consciousness is independent of the brain.
Well, it's also interesting that the thought bubble shape as well I was thinking of was vaguely the shape of a brain, almost being on the inside and looking around, of that sort of vague sort of brainy shape. But yeah, consciousness in the brain, it's such a weird thing. I almost feel like I've heard this before, this sort of idea is almost like the brain is kind of an antenna in a sense. Yeah. And it's more so that, the air, in air quotes, almost the consciousness of the universe. If you, another way of trying to do analogies and visualize it, if you had two halves of, let's say, magic, I'm talking about like a god level doing this, you had two halves of a brain that didn't work. When you push them together, they work. But you think of them all as they're hollow. And then as you clump them together, it catches just universal consciousness that's just around us, that it just exists in energy and all kinds of different things. You just clasp these two halves together and it becomes, that's consciousness. That's what it is. And so I feel like, with the idea of kind of separating itself from it in that sort of realm, I feel like it is almost, your brain has almost caught the consciousness in a way, that's almost what it is. It's just the consciousness can be almost flowing through you. And when you speak about flow states, one of the easiest ways, because some people may not be able to understand or visualize flow states. You described it perfectly, but some people may not. And even the most simple flow state is talking. Like, right, we're having this conversation, I'm not thinking about having to say the words that I am saying. The thoughts are coming in, and then my mouth is saying the thoughts. I'm not consciously having to process and do that. And that's a really, really simple flow state. But obviously, when you do get into it fully, and you get into actual true, what people call flow states, and the actual thing, because that was more of an analogy so people could understand it more. Because I've done it with playing video games or playing music or doing certain things. You, as you say, you don't realize you're even doing the thing. You just do it. It's autonomous in a sense, and it's that sort of. It just feels like the rhythm of what you're doing is flowing through you.
Yeah, like it's no longer a choice you're making. It's just something that it's automatic. Your body is sort of, I got what to do to let it move fluidly. Because if you try to control it, then suddenly there's like a halt. But I love something you said there that I've never thought about in my life. And you said you put two different things together to sort of end up with consciousness. This actually goes really nice with something you said earlier, which I never thought about before, to say that the universe is just energy, right? So let's divide that and say there is infinite energy and there is random chaotic matter. And that we would, in theory, move if the energy was gone, except there would be no perceiver. And there's no such thing as consciousness. There's energy and there's matter. And if I wasn't conscious, I'd be moving around, I'd be having this conversation, but there wouldn't be a conscious mind here thinking I'm talking to you. There would just be a conversation happening that's completely meaningless, even if the words are identical. You wouldn't be seeing it, I wouldn't be seeing it. Now, that energy plus the vessel equal consciousness, but the energy by itself is just energy that doesn't perceive. And the vessel itself is a vessel that doesn't perceive. But together they're conscious. How fascinating. I've never thought about that. It's a very interesting visual to say, because I guess the universe works in that way. Nothing is singular. Everything has to come in pairs, but also that pair is just the one thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's really weird. Polarity only exists in things that are singular. And that's complicated. Again, we draw a line, and so we have two different things, but they're just the same one thing, but they're two things. And that's a really weird contrast, because energy, physicality, put it together equals consciousness.
And that's the end of part 1. Thanks as always for tuning in, guys. As I said in the intro, part 2 will be out next week on the usual time on this very feed. But if you really would like to, you can check out both parts on Patreon right now in one full episode. For clarity, my Patreon has its own exclusive feed, and on that feed is going to have the Afterthoughts episodes, which episode 1 is already out and episode 2 will be out shortly, as well as this whole conversation that me and Jack had is uncut. So obviously I edited it out, like if I coughed or tapped the mic or something, but the whole thing is in one go as well, so you get a whole smooth conversation that's nearing 2 hours long. So if that's something that interests you, go check it out. I really appreciate anyone willing just to look at the Patreon, just to see what you think. It is at patreon.com/genuine Chit-Chat, so nice and easy, but the link is in the description. And as well as the Afterthoughts show, as well as unsplit full-length episodes of this, there's also going to be additional photos on there. I've been taking photos of some of my collectibles, the comics I'm reading, my tortoise, because that's a lot of fun. I've also put up the future guest list on there, which is showing the episodes that are coming out for the next few weeks that are guaranteed, as well as some other guests who are going to be on the show at some point, but we haven't specifically set a date yet. So you can get a look at basically what's to come in Genuine Chit-Chat. There'll be no splitting of part 1 and part 2, and you get additional content as well. And a lot of these things, there are 3 tiers on there, which I'm not going to go into all the details of the tiers on there, so you can go check that out yourselves. But for even the lowest tier, which is, as I said, £2 or $3 a month, you will get access to part 1 and part 2 of the episodes, as in part 2 being early, as well as the Afterthoughts new show. So you don't have to give a lot of money if you would like to. It really does help support the show, because as I put on my Patreon, and as I've said here, this podcast does actually cost me money. Now, it is a passion of love, and I'm fine for it to cost me money, because that's why I do it, not because for any other reason. But I just thought, if people want additional content and want to help me not cost myself money every month, because it costs about £25 a month to get this show running with Zoom Pro and with posting on hosting on Podbean. It's about 25 quid there or thereabouts. It's not a big cost to me. I can afford it, but I just thought two birds, one stone. You guys get to support the show and you get more content for it. So if that's what you fancy, go check that out. And I also just wanted to take this opportunity to say a very big thank you to 3 patrons who have started supporting the show already before even a full-length episode of this show has been out, but they have managed to get the first episode of the Afterthoughts series, which I'll be uploading another episode of that soon. So I just want to say thank you to Margaret Green, thank you to Tony Farina of Indie Comic Spotlight, and thank you to Frank Burton of Philistine Press / the Ragbag Podcast. All 3 of you have made me incredibly happy, and I thank you so much for your generous support, and I really hope you guys enjoy the additional content. Anyway, I did also want to mention as well that when you guys tune in for part 2, I will say at the start of the episode, there's a slight trigger warning. There's an example that I actually use, which is about rape. Now, we don't go into detail specifically about the act of being raped or anything like that, but we use it as an example talking about sort of abstract ideas and good and evil and, really horrendous, unforgiving things can cause stuff which may be considered to be a net positive. Things like that. It is quite a dark line of thinking, and we do, in the conversation, mention that it's a dark line of thinking and clarify that sort of things. But I want to make sure that people are aware, just in case they have any prior issues with that sort of thing and sexual assault. I don't want to just spring that on them and things. So that is a small part of the conversation. As I said, I think it's towards the start. We talk about it for about 5 or 10 minutes as a concept before the conversation does go elsewhere. So I just want to flag that up to you guys as well. So aside from that, really, I've got a podcast due for recording on Monday with a very interesting individual. But as I said, on here, I don't really like to say who it is unless they're a returning guest, just in case it jinx it. But she is an ex-porn star, essentially. There's a lot more to her than that. A mental health advocate, an advocate for cannabis and psychedelic medicines and things. An overall really, really interesting individual that I've been wanting to talk to for a while. And then as well as that, there's several other people. There's an artist who's going to be coming on the show who has quite a unique brand of rap, as well as a returning guest, a friend of mine, Steve. Steve is Superheroes For Dummies. He came on when I spoke to BZ about his Green Lantern fan film. And then also there's another individual who we're going to be speaking to who's got another DC fan film about a different character, as well as this individual who is an artist in rap with a very different sort of stance on it and things. So Steve is coming on quite a few times in the next few weeks, so look out for that. In addition to that, there are quite a few things in the pipeline. There's going to be, hopefully, another Star Wars content creator coming on the show. There's also a few other people that I've kind of reached out to, and we're going to kind of go from there. But if you want the specific details of that, as I said, you can check it out on Patreon. If you want to get in contact with me in any way, you can find me on social media at Genuine Chit-Chat on Instagram, Twitter, and on Facebook. And as well as that, I've also got my other show, which is Star Wars Comics and Canon. Just before I go into that, I realised I wanted to mention again, I appeared on the Just Conversation podcast, episode 4.09. It was out on the 26th of September 2020, and if you liked part 1 of this chat, you don't want to pay on Patreon for part 2, you're happy to wait, but you want to hear something else about that same sort of thing, go over to the Just Conversations podcast and listen to mine and Jack's conversation. It's about 2 hours and a bit long, I think, and we talk about this general idea, but we talk about God, universe, divinity, existence, that sort of thing, so make sure you go check that out as well. And as I said, finally is my other podcast, which is Star Wars Comics in Canon, and that is on the feed of Comics in Motion. And the most recent episode I just did was actually a Rogue One sequel comic. So Han, Luke, and Leia all go to Jeddah, and they speak with a character called Benthic, who's also known as Two Tubes, who features in Rogue One and is also in Solo, a Star Wars story, right at the end with Enfys Nest and the Cloud Riders. And I've taken some photos of that. I want to clarify that with Star Wars Comics in Canon, I will be uploading photos, or I've already uploaded photos of them. I try and upload photos of the comics I'm tackling on the day of release, which is Saturdays. Sometimes I miss it and it ends up being on a Sunday, so apologies for that. What I've also started doing is when I take the photos on my phone, which I normally take on sort of Wednesday or Thursday, I'm now going to be uploading them to Patreon as well a little bit early. So if you also want to see photos of Star Wars comics early, if you're a big Star Wars fan and things, and you want to get an insight of what the next episode of Star Wars is going to be about and things, you can check that out too. So it's all sort of, Patreon is just early access as well as the exclusive show. That's relatively speaking what Patreon is all about. But yeah, with the Star Wars comics in canon as well, there's loads of other things that I've tackled on there. There's the Dr. Aphra comics, there's the Star Wars main run of comics, there's the Age of Rebellion comics, which are one-shots based on certain characters. I'm doing a TIE Fighter miniseries comic soon. Shortly, I will have tackled all the Star Wars miniseries and all the Star Wars one-shots for the Marvel run and the Canon comics, because obviously it's Star Wars comics in canon. So I'll have tackled all of them, and then I'll just be tackling some of the ongoing series, like the second run of Vader comics, because I've already tackled the first. Eventually, when I finish the main run of Star Wars, then there's going to be the second run of Aphra, the third run of Vader, the second run of Star Wars comics, the Bounty Hunter series, as well as the High Republic series. So there's lots of different things to be able to sink my teeth into, and also I'm going to have more conversations and things about Star Wars, which I'll probably post both on Genuine Chit-Chat and on Star Wars Comics in Canon, but we will see how that goes. I always want to clarify that at some point in March, there's going to be a roundtable Snyder Cut Justice League discussion, which I think I'm going to be hosting. It's going to be myself, and from what I can tell, Chris and Dave of Comics in Motion, Steve, once again, of the Superheroes For Dummies podcast, and I think Max Byrne of the Mandatory Marvel and DC podcast, which all of those podcasts I just mentioned are found on the feed of Comics in Motion, along with Star Wars Comics in Canon, and that conversation will likely be posted both on here on Genuine Chit Chat and also on Comics in Motion. So that is pretty much enough for me, I think, guys. I've tooted my own horn for so long in this outro thing. I'm kind of running out of breath almost. But I just want to say to you guys, thank you so much for always listening to the show. I really appreciate everyone willing to check out the show. And I know I've had a few new listeners and things recently due to interactions on social media and seeing the numbers and things. So anyone who is new to listening to the show, I just want to say thank you for giving the show a go. It means the world to me for anyone just listening to the show. And although I have just launched a Patreon, and you get my undying love. One of the Patreon perks is that you get my undying love if you become a patron. And although I do appreciate, I think out of time recording this, I've got a few people on there right now who've already donated some money, which means the absolute world to me. But if anyone else wants to donate, that's even more incredible. And it's taken me back, really. It's just incredible. It makes me so happy. But if you don't want to, fear not. I still appreciate you just the same. You are all appreciated listening to this. And I just want to say thank you for not only listening to the show, getting me to be able to have, guest spots on other people's podcasts and talk to people like Jack, but also being able to be such amazing listeners to even allow me to consider trying to do a Patreon, because like a year ago I wouldn't have even considered anyone would give me any money for doing this show that obviously I do for free. Well, my two shows I do for free and things, and maybe some of the Patreon costs, if it goes over the £25 I spend, that will cover some of the costs for my Star Wars comics and things. So yeah, anyway, as I said, guys, just thank you. I appreciate all of you. I hope that while it's middle of February and everything's a bit still crazy with COVID and lockdown and stuff, I hope you guys are staying safe, are doing okay, and I hope that conversations like this one today kind of help distract you a little bit in some ways. So yeah, I'm going to go now, guys. Thank you as always. I'll be back next week with part 2. And if you are a Patreon supporter, you'll have already listened to part 2, no doubt. But you will also be getting the Afterthoughts episodes. So check out those. Thanks as always, guys. And I'll talk to you next week.